The first signs came from the Kuiper Belt monitoring stations, crystalline structures, perfectly geometric, moving against the solar wind. Dr. Sarah Chen watched the readings with growing fascination as more data poured in from the outer system sensors. These weren't natural formations. They were ships, massive vessels composed entirely of living crystal. "Movement detected in Sector 7, announced the AI assistant. Multiple objects accelerating toward inner system coordinates. Sarah's excitement turned to concern as she analyzed their trajectory. The crystal ships weren't just passing through. They were on an intercept course with Earth. She immediately initiated first contact protocols, but the response she received wasn't what anyone had expected. The message came in perfect English, transmitted on all frequencies. "We are the Vracs. Your biological imperfection ends today." Within hours, the first attacks began. The crystal ships, now numbering in the hundreds, unleashed energy beams that literally rewrote matter at the atomic level, turning organic material into crystalline structures. Their first targets were Earth's orbital defense platforms, transforming them into glittering, useless sculptures. Admiral James Cooper stood in the United Earth Defense Command Center, watching as another satellite cluster went dark. "They're not just attacking us," he observed grimly. "They're trying to perfect us, according to their own twisted definition." The Vracs were unlike anything humanity had encountered in their centuries of space exploration. They weren't invaders seeking resources or territory. They were zealots who genuinely believed they were doing the universe a favor by converting all organic life into crystalline form. Their ships weren't merely vessels but extensions of themselves, massive geometric shapes that could split, combine, and reconfigure at will. Traditional weapons proved nearly useless against their crystalline hulls. Railguns, plasma cannons, even nuclear devices, the Vracs simply absorbed the energy and used it to grow stronger. They seemed to be the perfect enemy, intelligent, unified, and virtually indestructible. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had announced their intentions. In the weeks following first contact, while the Vracs methodically worked their way through the outer system defenses, humanity wasn't sitting idle. In underground laboratories and hidden research facilities across the globe, scientists worked feverishly to understand their new enemy. Dr. Chen led one such team at the Quantum Materials Research Facility beneath the Atacama Desert. "Every crystal has a resonant frequency," she explained to Admiral Cooper during an emergency briefing. "No matter how perfect their structure, no matter how advanced their technology, they can't escape basic physics." The Admiral leaned forward, interest sparking in his eyes. "You're saying we can shatter them?" "Not exactly," Sarah replied, pulling up a holographic model of a Vrax ship. "But we can disrupt them. Their consciousness, their very being, is maintained through quantum coherence within their crystalline structure. We don't need to destroy them physically. We just need to interfere with their ability to maintain that coherence." It was the first real hope Earth had seen since the invasion began. But developing the technology was only half the battle. The harder part would be getting close enough to use it. The Vracs had set up a blockade around Earth, their ships forming a geometric web that intercepted anything larger than a few meters across. They were patient, methodical, and absolutely convinced of their superiority. Why rush? They had all the time in the world to perfect this flawed organic world. But Earth had one advantage they hadn't counted on. While the Vracs had evolved beyond biological form, they still thought in crystalline patterns, rigid, predictable, perfect. Humanity, with all its flaws and imperfections, was anything but predictable. Admiral Cooper gathered the world's military leaders for what would be the most important briefing in human history. "The Vracs think they're perfect," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "But perfection is static. It cannot adapt, cannot evolve. And that's exactly why we're going to win." As he spoke, screens around the room lit up with implementation plans for Operation Flaw Theory. It wasn't just a military strategy. It was a complete rethinking of how to fight a war. The Vraks expected symmetrical warfare, perfect formations, logical responses. They were about to learn why imperfection was humanity's greatest strength. The first phase would begin at dawn, and for the first time since the crystal ships appeared in the Kuiper Belt, Earth's defenders allowed themselves to feel something they'd almost forgotten: hope. Operation Flaw Theory began not with a bang, but with silence. Complete radio silence. Every transmitter on Earth went dark simultaneously, creating an electromagnetic quiet that hadn't existed since the dawn of the Industrial Age. The Vraks, who had been monitoring and analyzing human communications patterns for weeks, suddenly found themselves blind. "Let them think we're giving up," Admiral Cooper had said during the briefing. "Let them think their perfection has won." It went against every military instinct he had, but this wasn't a conventional war. It required unconventional thinking. The Vraks ships maintained their perfect geometric formation around Earth, but their behavior changed subtly. The constant attempts to convert Earth's infrastructure into crystal slowed. They began to move closer, investigating the sudden silence. Deep underground, Dr. Chen and her team worked on the final calibrations of the quantum disruption devices. They had discovered something fascinating about the Vraks' crystalline nature. Their need for perfection wasn't just ideology, it was survival. Any flaw in their structure could cascade through their entire being. "They're not just perfect because they want to be," she explained to her team. "They're perfect because they have to be. And that's their greatest weakness." The first phase of the counterattack involved no weapons at all. Instead, thousands of small, irregular objects were released into orbit. Space junk, essentially. But space junk designed to create specific patterns of chaos in the Vraks' perfect formation. The crystalline ships were forced to constantly adjust their positions to avoid collisions, creating tiny imperfections in their geometric web. It was like throwing sand into a precise machine. Small disruptions that forced larger corrections. Meanwhile, on the ground, humanity prepared for the next phase. The quantum disruption devices were distributed to key locations worldwide, disguised as debris from the Vraks' earlier attacks. Each one was imperfect in its own way, deliberately flawed to prevent the Vraks from recognizing them as technology. Their perfection makes them predictable, Admiral Cooper told his commanders. They can only respond in perfect ways to what they perceive as threats. But chaos, imperfection, these things are beyond their comprehension. The plan relied on this fundamental difference between human and Vraks psychology. Humans could adapt, could embrace imperfection, could turn weakness into strength. The Vraks, for all their power, could only follow their nature. As the days passed, the Vraks began to show signs of confusion. Their perfect formations became increasingly difficult to maintain as the orbital debris field grew more complex. Their attempts to analyze the situation were hampered by their own rigid thinking patterns. Then came the anomalies, small, seemingly random fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field, irregular power signatures from abandoned cities, patterns that almost made sense, but not quite. The Vraks devoted more and more processing power to analyzing these inconsistencies, trying to force them into understandable patterns. They didn't realize they were being played. Each anomaly was carefully crafted to draw their attention, to make them look for perfection where none existed. The more they tried to understand, the more processing power they devoted to the task, the more their own perfect structure began to show microscopic strains. Dr. Chen monitored the readings with growing excitement. "Their quantum coherence is fluctuating," she reported. "They're trying so hard to understand our chaos that they're creating imperfections in their own structure." The Vraks had never encountered an enemy like humanity before. Their previous conquests had all followed the same pattern: species that either fought back directly and were overwhelmed, or tried to run and were caught. But humans had looked at an overwhelmingly superior force and decided to win by being deliberately imperfect. Admiral Cooper watched the strategic display as the Vraks ships began to move in increasingly erratic patterns. They were still dangerous, perhaps more dangerous now that they were confused. but they were no longer the perfect, unstoppable force they had been. "Send the signal," he ordered. "It's time for Phase 3. Across the globe, the quantum disruption devices activated, not with a coordinated burst, but in a seemingly random pattern. Each one emitted a different frequency, creating a chaotic web of quantum interference that played havoc with the Vrax's crystalline structure. The perfect invasion was about to meet humanity's greatest weapon: creative disorder. The first crack appeared in a Vrax ship over the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't large, barely visible even with high-powered magnification, but its significance was enormous. The perfect crystalline structure had developed a flaw. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as she examined the sensor readings. "This shouldn't be possible according to their physics," she whispered. "Unless..." Her eyes widened with sudden understanding. "They're doing it to themselves." The quantum disruption devices weren't directly damaging the Vrax ships. Instead, they were creating a state of quantum uncertainty that the Vrax themselves couldn't process. In their desperate attempts to maintain perfect order, they were actually amplifying the chaos. Admiral Cooper immediately recognized the opportunity. "Launch the resonance probes," he ordered. "All of them. Different frequencies, different trajectories. Let's give them more patterns to analyze." Thousands of small probes shot up from hidden silos across the planet. Each one emitted a unique quantum signature, creating a cacophony of conflicting patterns. The Vrax ships, already struggling to maintain their perfect structure while analyzing Earth's chaotic defenses, now faced an exponentially more complex problem. More cracks appeared. Some ships began to display irregular geometric patterns, a horrifying development for beings who define their existence through perfect symmetry. The Vrax responded by trying to establish new, more complex formations to compensate for the chaos. It was exactly what humanity had hoped for. "They can't help themselves," Dr. Chen explained during an emergency briefing. "Their entire consciousness is based on perfect crystalline patterns. When faced with chaos, they attempt to create larger, more complex patterns to encompass and control it. But they can't. The patterns keep breaking down." The Vrax's response to their first real defeat was revealing. Instead of retreating or adapting their strategy, they doubled down on their core nature. More ships arrived, forming even more elaborate geometric patterns in an attempt to impose order on the growing chaos. But humanity had learned from the first phase of the war. Each new Vrax ship was met with more irregular probes, more quantum disruption, more deliberate imperfection. The humans had turned their greatest weakness, their chaotic, unpredictable nature, into an insurmountable advantage. Deep in the quantum research facility, Dr. Chen made another breakthrough. "Look at these readings," she said, pointing to a complex display of quantum states. "The Vrax aren't just connected to their ships, they're connected to each other. Their entire civilization is a single quantum-entangled crystalline network." Admiral Cooper leaned forward, immediately grasping the implications. "So when one of them experiences chaos..." "They all do," Chen finished, "to varying degrees. And they can't shut it out because their perfect nature requires them to try to understand and control it. They're trapped by their own perfection." The war entered a new phase. Instead of trying to destroy the Vrax ships, Earth's forces focused on creating increasingly complex patterns of chaos. Each probe, each disruption device, each seemingly random emission was carefully calculated to force the Vrax to expend more energy trying to maintain their perfect structure. The cracks spread. Not just physical cracks in their crystalline forms, but fundamental fractures in their unified consciousness. Some ships began to move independently, breaking formation in ways that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. For the first time, the Vrax experienced something alien to their perfect nature: doubt. In their quantum-linked consciousness, a debate raged. Some argued for retreat, others for escalation. Their perfect unity began to show signs of strain as different factions emerged, each one certain that their solution was the perfect response to the human threat. Admiral Cooper watched the disarray with grim satisfaction. They're fighting themselves now, he observed. Their need for perfection has turned inward. But victory wasn't assured yet. A cornered enemy was often the most dangerous, and the Vraks still possessed overwhelming technological superiority. As their perfect formation broke down, individual ships began acting with increasing desperation, launching crystallization attacks at random. Humanity had cracked their perfect facade, but the Vraks were far from defeated. The question now was whether they would break completely or find a way to adapt, something their perfect nature had never required them to do before. The next phase would determine not just the fate of Earth, but the very nature of perfection itself. The first human offensive began with a single ship, the HSS Prometheus, a prototype vessel equipped with quantum disruption technology, slipped through a gap in the fragmenting Vraks formation. Its mission wasn't to attack, it was to observe. Captain Maya Rodriguez stood on the bridge, watching the crystalline ships scatter as her vessel approached. The Vraks no longer maintained their perfect geometric patterns. Instead, individual ships moved erratically, some clustering together in defensive formations, others maintaining distance even from their own kind. They're afraid, she realized, not of destruction. The Vraks were still nearly indestructible, but of imperfection, of chaos, of change. The Prometheus carried Dr. Chen's latest innovation, a quantum scanner capable of mapping the Vraks' collective consciousness. As they pushed deeper into the enemy formation, the data began flowing back to Earth. It's remarkable, Dr. Chen reported from her lab. Their entire civilization is like a vast crystalline computer network. But now there are gaps, areas where the quantum coherence is breaking down. They're beginning to experience individuality, and they're terrified of it. Admiral Cooper had anticipated this moment. The second phase of the offensive began as hundreds of smaller ships, each equipped with modified quantum disruption devices, launched from hidden bases across Earth and its colonies. But these ships didn't attack directly. Instead, they began broadcasting a signal that Dr. Chen had discovered in the Vraks' own quantum communications, the equivalent of a question that had no perfect answer. The effect was devastating. The Vraks ships that received the transmission began attempting to solve the unsolvable paradox, their crystalline structures straining as they tried to force an imperfect problem into their perfect framework. They can't ignore it, Dr. Chen explained to the War Council. Their nature compels them to seek perfect solutions. By giving them problems that have no perfect solutions, we're forcing them to either adapt or break. Some broke, magnificent crystalline ships, each one a marvel of cosmic engineering, shattered into clouds of glittering dust as their internal coherence collapsed. Others began to show signs of something unprecedented: adaptation. Captain Rodriguez watched through the Prometheus' sensors as a group of Vraks ships began moving in deliberately irregular patterns. They were attempting to mimic the chaos that had proven so effective against them. They're learning, she reported back to Earth, but it's killing them. Their very nature fights against the imperfection they're trying to embrace. The human fleet pressed its advantage, moving deeper into what had once been Vraks-controlled space. Each ship broadcast its own unique quantum signature, creating a web of controlled chaos that the Vraks couldn't predict or counter. Admiral Cooper coordinated the offensive from Earth, watching as the perfect crystalline formations continued to fragment. They thought their perfection made them invincible, he observed. Instead, it made them vulnerable to the one thing they couldn't comprehend: the power of imperfection. But victory had its price. As the Vraks' consciousness fractured, some ships became increasingly erratic and dangerous. Without the restraining influence of their collective mind, individual vessels began lashing out with desperate, unpredictable attacks. The war entered its most dangerous phase. The Vraks were no longer a unified force, but a scattered collection of immensely powerful entities, each one struggling with concepts that threatened their very existence. Dr. Chen's quantum scans revealed something else. Deep in Vraks space, their homeworld pulsed with intense quantum energy. The source of their perfection, And perhaps the key to ending the war lay waiting. Captain Rodriguez received new orders. The Prometheus would lead a small fleet of ships through the chaos of the fragmenting Vrax forces, pushing toward their home system. Their mission was no longer just survival. It was to force an entire civilization to confront the ultimate question: is perfection worth the price of extinction? As the human fleet advanced, the stars themselves seemed to shimmer with quantum distortion. Reality itself straining under the weight of the paradox humanity had forced upon the perfect beings who had thought to remake the universe in their image. The Vraxed homeworld hung in space like a perfect geometric crystal, its surface a complex lattice of interconnected structures that seemed to defy the normal rules of planetary formation. As the Prometheus led its small fleet toward this alien marvel, Captain Rodriguez couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and sadness. "We're detecting massive quantum energy signatures," her science officer reported. "The entire planet appears to be one giant crystalline computer." Dr. Chen's voice crackled over the quantum comm. "That's not just their homeworld. It's their origin point. The source of their drive for perfection. According to these readings, it's also the anchor point for their quantum-entangled consciousness." The implications were clear. This wasn't just a planet. It was the heart of the Vrax civilization, the physical manifestation of their perfect nature. And it was about to face its greatest challenge. The human fleet deployed in an intentionally irregular pattern around the crystal world. Each ship activated its quantum disruption devices, not in unison, but in a carefully orchestrated chaos of different frequencies and patterns. The response was immediate. The planet's surface began to pulse with energy as the Vrax collective consciousness tried to maintain its perfect order in the face of mounting chaos. Crystalline structures shifted and realigned, attempting to find patterns in the unpredictable human assault. But humanity had one more card to play. Dr. Chen had discovered something in her analysis of the Vrax quantum network, a fundamental truth that the crystalline beings had forgotten in their pursuit of perfection. "Send the transmission," Admiral Cooper ordered from Earth. Captain Rodriguez activated the special quantum package Dr. Chen had prepared. It wasn't a weapon or a virus. It was information. Specifically, it was the complete history of evolution on Earth, showing how imperfection and adaptation had driven the development of life itself. The data streamed into the Vrax collective consciousness. Billions of years of trial and error, of species adapting and changing, of imperfect solutions leading to extraordinary developments. Most importantly, it showed how perfection, whenever it was achieved, led to extinction because it couldn't adapt to change. The crystal world's surface erupted with energy as the Vrax tried to process this information. Their perfect consciousness, already strained by weeks of human-induced chaos, faced an undeniable truth: perfection was a dead end. Something extraordinary began to happen. Across the surface of the planet, new patterns began to emerge, not the perfect geometric shapes of before, but organic, irregular formations. The Vrax were changing. "They're making the choice," Dr. Chen observed, her voice filled with wonder. "Their collective consciousness is fragmenting, but not in the chaotic way we saw before. They're choosing to evolve." The transformation spread through the quantum network, reaching every Vrax ship and structure in the galaxy. Some rejected the change, their crystalline forms shattering as they clung to their notion of perfection. Others began to adapt, their structures becoming more fluid, more organic. Captain Rodriguez watched as the perfect crystal world before her began to transform. They're not just accepting imperfection, she realized. They're embracing it. The war ended not with a victory or surrender, but with an evolution. The Vrax, or what they were becoming, withdrew their forces from Earth's space, not in defeat, but in recognition that their path to perfection had been fundamentally flawed. In the years that followed, humanity established cautious contact with the transformed Vrax. They were still crystalline beings, still incredibly advanced, but they had abandoned their rigid pursuit of perfection. Instead, they had begun to explore the power of controlled chaos, of adaptation, of change. Admiral Cooper stood with Dr. Chen in the quantum research facility, watching a transmission from the former Vrax homeworld. The once perfect crystal planet now pulsed with shifting patterns and organic shapes, a testament to the power of imperfection. "We didn't just save Earth," Chen mused. "We saved them from themselves." "Maybe that's the real perfection," Cooper replied. "Not the absence of flaws, but the ability to learn from them, to change, to grow." Across the galaxy, a new era began. Humanity had proved that their greatest weakness, their imperfect, chaotic nature, was actually their greatest strength. And in doing so, they had taught an ancient, powerful civilization the most important lesson of all. True perfection lies not in being flawless, but in having the courage to embrace one's flaws and learn from them. The stars seemed brighter somehow, as if the universe itself celebrated the triumph not of perfection, but of evolution itself.